I'd worked 16 hours when I found my mother's front door locked against me. My stepmother stood behind the glass, smiling, and held up a number on a piece of paper, $42,000. My father's truck was in the driveway. He never came to the door. It was past 9 at night. I'd done a double at the hospital, the kind where you stop feeling your own feet around hour 12, and I'd driven straight to the house afterward because it was Thursday, and Thursday was the night I checked on the place, wiped the counters, ran the tap so the pipes wouldn't sit, sat for a minute in the room that used to be my mother's. My mother had been dead 2 years. The house was the last place she still existed. I came up the porch steps with my key already out, the way you do a thing you've done 1,000 times without thinking. The key didn't turn. I thought it was the cold, the lock sticking. I tried again. And then the porch light came on over my head, and through the glass panel in the door, I saw Linda standing in the front hall in her robe, arms crossed, looking at me like I was a salesman who'd had the nerve to come back. She didn't open the door. She held up a piece of paper, flat against the glass so I could read it. She'd written the number in marker, big enough to see from the steps, $42,000. And under it, smaller, back rent plus access. I just stood there with my dead key in my hand. I looked past her, down the hall, toward the kitchen, where the light was on and my father's shape was sitting at the table. He didn't get up. He had to have heard the porch steps, heard her come to the door, heard all of it. He sat at my mother's kitchen table and he did not turn around. And in my bag, the bag I'd carried into that house every Thursday for 2 years, was the one thing that would end this, though I didn't reach for it that night. I want to be honest about that. That night, I just stood on the steps in the cold and let her smile at me. What I finally set down on the hood of a sheriff's cruiser 3 weeks later is the rest of the story. But it starts here, with a locked door and a number, and my father's back. To understand why that locked door nearly broke me, you have to know what my mother said about that house before she died. She'd been sick about 4 months by the end. Pancreatic, fast, the way it usually is. Near the last of it, when she was mostly in the bed they'd set up in the front room so she could see the yard, she got very practical about things, the way some people do when they can see the edge coming. She made lists. She told me where the deed was, where the insurance papers were, which neighbor had a spare set of tools my father always borrowed and never returned. And one afternoon, with the light coming in gold across the quilt, she took my hand and she said, "This house stays safe. For you. I made sure of it. Whatever happens with your father, the house is yours to keep. Don't let anybody tell you different." I thought it was the medication talking, a little. I squeezed her hand and said, "Okay, Mom, okay." I didn't understand yet that she'd meant it as an instruction, not a comfort. She'd done something. I just didn't know what. My father remarried 14 months after the funeral. Linda. I tried. I want you to know I tried. I went to the wedding. I brought a gift. I called her by her name and meant to mean it. But within a month of her moving in, the small things started. My mother's photos came down off the hallway wall, just to repaint. The repainting never happened. The photos went into a box in the garage and the walls stayed bare. Her good dishes got donated. The chair my mother sat in to do the crossword every morning, gone. No explanation. Here's the practical truth that locked door was sitting on top of, and I'll say it in one breath so we can move past the paperwork. My mother had legally protected my right to that house, in writing, before she died. Linda lived there. But Linda did not own the right to keep me out, and somewhere in that house, getting boxed up as clutter was the proof. That's what I was losing if Linda won, not money. I had a job, I could lose $42,000 and recover. What I was losing was the last room on earth where my mother's instructions still held, "This house stays safe for you." If Linda could lock me out and call it back rent, then my mother's last act of protection became a piece of paper that meant nothing. That's the thing I could not afford. The locked door wasn't the first time Linda made me pay to belong somewhere I already belonged. It was just the loudest. To see how we got there, you have to go back to the first winter, the first tax bill. It came about 8 months after she moved in. My father called me, he still called me himself back then, before he handed even that over to her, and he was sheepish on the phone in a way that should have warned me. He said the property tax had come due and things were tight right now, and Linda was not good with that kind of money, and could I maybe help out this once, just so it didn't go delinquent on the house? The house. He knew which word to use. He said, The house, not we, because he knew the house was the lever that moved me. I paid it. Of course I paid it. It was a little over $4,000, and I told myself it was for my mother, for keeping the place safe, and I drove a check over rather than transfer it because some part of me wanted to hand it to my father's face and have him say thank you. I did hand it to him. We stood in the driveway. He took the envelope and he said, "You're a good girl, Maya." And he patted my shoulder, and Linda watched from the porch with her arms crossed, and she didn't say anything at all. That should have been my warning, the arms crossed on the porch. A person who is grateful comes down off the porch. A person who is taking inventory stays up on it and watches. I drove home that night, and I remember sitting in my car in my own parking lot for a while, not going in. Because I'd felt something I didn't have a name for yet. I'd felt like a guest who'd been handed the check at a dinner she thought she was hosting. In my mother's house. Paying my mother's taxes. I told myself I was being sensitive. I was tired. I worked a lot. I was grieving. I told myself a lot of things in that parking lot, and every one of them was a way of not noticing that the bill had been a test, and I'd shown them exactly how I'd answer the next one. I kept the receipt, though. I want you to remember that I kept the receipt. I put it in a folder in my bag without quite deciding to. I told myself it was for taxes. It was not really for taxes. Some part of me that was smarter than the rest of me had already started keeping a record because some part of me had already seen Linda's arms crossed on that porch and understood what it meant before I let myself understand it. The second winter, it was the roof, and the roof is where I should have known for certain. A storm came through in February and tore up the flashing on the back slope, and water started coming into the upstairs hall, the hallway where my mother's photos used to hang, as it happened. My father called. Same voice, a little more practice now. Tight, right now. Linda's not good with this. The house? Maya. The house. It was January cold, the kind that gets into the joints, and I didn't have the money loose, so I put the roof on a card, close to $6,000 by the time the man was done, and I drove over on my day off to meet the contractor because somebody had to be there and it wasn't going to be the two of them. I stood in the frozen backyard in my mother's old barn coat that still hung by the door, holding a thermos, watching a stranger climb around on the roof of the house my mother told me to keep safe. Linda came out once. She brought the contractor a coffee, not me, the contractor, and she stood next to me looking up at the roof, and she said in this light, pleasant voice, "It's so good of you to help your father like this. Help your father." As if the house were his alone and I was a kind neighbor doing a favor. As if my name weren't the one my mother had written into the deed protections in the front room with the gold light. I didn't correct her. That's a thing I have to own in this story. For 2 years, I didn't correct her, not once, because correcting her felt like making a scene, and I'd been raised by a woman who fixed things instead of making scenes. So I drank my coffee, and I watched the roof, and I said, he'd do it for me, which wasn't even true. We both knew it wasn't true. But it was the polite thing, and I was so committed to the polite thing that I handed her 2 more years of cover for it. That night, the receipt for the roof went into the folder with the tax receipt. The folder was getting thicker. I'd stopped pretending it was for my accountant. I knew, by then, that I was keeping a record of every time I paid to be allowed near my own mother's house, even if I couldn't yet have told you what I thought I'd ever do with it. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until the next winter, was that the thing that would actually save me wasn't in that folder at all. It was already in the house. It was sitting in a cardboard box in the garage, in Linda's own handwriting marked clutter, waiting for me to open it. The third winter, Linda boxed up the last of my mother, and that's the winter I found the deed. She'd been escalating all year. I could see it even through my own determined politeness. The photos had been the first thing, then the dishes, then the chair. By the third winter, she'd moved on to the closets. I came on a Thursday and found 4 cardboard boxes stacked in the garage, each one labeled in her round, careful marker, clutter. Inside them was my mother, her sweaters, a shoebox of letters, her reading glasses, the cheap drugstore ones she bought 3 at a time and lost constantly, her crossword books, the margins full of her handwriting. I stood in that cold garage and I went through those boxes on my knees because I was not going to let my mother get driven to the dump labeled clutter. And down at the bottom of the third box, under the crossword books, was a flat manila envelope, soft at the edges from handling. My mother's writing on the front. It just said, "Maya, keep this safe." Inside was the deed. and clipped to the deed a second document, the one she'd had drawn up in those last 4 months when she was making her lists and getting practical. I read it 3 times standing in the garage with my breath fogging. I'm going to give you the whole legal weight of it in one sentence, the way I promised, because you don't need the jargon, and a tired woman driving home doesn't need me to read her a statute. My mother had recorded a protection on that house that gave me a permanent legal right of access and a claim that could not be erased by my father remarrying, or by Linda, or by anyone changing a lock. She'd known. That's what undid me, kneeling in the garage. She had known, 2 years before she died, what these people were, and she'd quietly gone to a county office while she was dying and made me a key that Linda could never change. This house stays safe. For you. I made sure of it. She hadn't been on the medication. She'd been telling me exactly what she'd done, and I'd squeezed her hand and said, "Okay, Mom," and missed it. I took the envelope. I did not tell them I had it. I put it in my bag, in the folder, with the receipts, and from that Thursday on, I carried it. Every shift. Every visit. It rode in my bag through hundreds of ordinary days, because some part of me never once trusted the smile through that glass, and that part of me turned out to be the only part worth listening to. So now you know what was in my bag the night of the locked door. The question that hung over those 3 weeks between the locked door and the cruiser was simpler and worse. Would my father, even once, even at the very end, choose me? I want to walk you through those 3 weeks, because the door was just the opening shot. After that night, I didn't bang on the glass. I didn't bang on the glass. I went home, and the next morning I called my father's cell, and it rang, and then a text came back from his number, but it wasn't him. I knew his voice in text, and this wasn't it, that said, "Until the back rent is resolved, it's best you don't come by. We need boundaries." L. She'd signed my father's phone with her own initial. That tells you everything about where he'd gone. The back rent was an invention, of course. $42,000, supposedly, for the Thursdays I'd spent in the house over 2 years. Except by Linda's arithmetic, I'd somehow been a tenant the whole time, accruing rent on the house I'd been paying the taxes and the roof on. She'd taken every dollar I'd handed over out of love and grief and reframed it backward, not help, but a debt I owed for the privilege of being let in. It was almost impressive. It was the same move my whole family made in different costumes: take the thing you gave and bill you for having given it. I called my father 6 times over those 3 weeks. He answered once. I could hear the television behind him, and I could hear him being careful, choosing words like a man reading them off a card someone had written. He said, "Maya, Linda just thinks everybody should contribute fairly." Contribute fairly. I asked him, and my voice did something I'm not proud of. It cracked. I asked him, "Dad, do you actually think I owe you rent on Mom's house?" And there was a long pause, the TV laughing at something in the background, and he said, "I think it's complicated, honey." And then, quieter, "Linda's going to handle it. Linda's going to handle it." My father, in my mother's house, telling me that the woman who'd boxed up my mother as clutter was going to handle whether I was allowed inside it. That was the moment I stopped calling him. Not out of anger, out of clarity. I'd spent 2 years and a small fortune waiting for my father to come down off the porch, and he was never coming down off the porch. So I stopped waiting for the door to open from the inside. I had the key my mother left me. It was time to use the only kind of key Linda couldn't change. Linda made the call herself. That's the part she'll never live down if there's any justice in how these stories travel through a family. She called the sheriff on me. It happened on a Saturday. I decided to go back to the house in daylight with witnesses available to formally establish that I was being denied access I had a legal right to. I wasn't going to break anything. I just parked in the driveway behind my father's truck, walked up to that locked door, and stood on my own mother's porch. And Linda came to the glass, and she had her phone in her hand already, and she said through the door, loud enough for the neighbors, "You are trespassing. I am calling the police." I said, "Good, call them." I watched that throw her. Just for a second, the smile flickered. She'd expected me to retreat, the way I'd retreated for 2 years. Retreating was my whole documented history with her. Instead, I sat down on the top porch step in plain view, and I waited, with my bag in my lap. And she made the call, and I heard her tell the dispatcher, "There was a woman refusing to leave her property. Please send someone. Her property." The cruiser came about 20 minutes later. No lights, just rolled up to the curb on a quiet Saturday street with a few neighbors now openly watching from their yards. The deputy who got out was younger than me, polite, a little bored, the way you'd be on a call that's been phoned in as a trespasser and is probably a family thing. He asked Linda to step out onto the porch. She came out, and now my father was in the doorway behind her, finally hovering, not committing to either the inside or the out. The deputy turned to me and asked me to explain my side. And here is where I want you to watch carefully, because this is where the whole thing turned, and it did not turn because of paperwork. It turned because I said one word, and the word changed the temperature of that porch. He asked me why I wouldn't leave the property. And I didn't say, because they owe me. And I didn't say, because I've been paying, and I didn't list my grievances. I said, because my mother recorded a deed protection on this house that gives me legal access, and I have the documents in my bag. You're welcome to verify them with the county. Deed. The word landed differently than rent had. Linda's mouth opened to keep talking, and the deputy held up one hand. Not rude, just the gesture of a man who has just realized the call he's on is not the call he was sent to. He looked at me and then at her, and he said, "Ma'am, hold on." And he asked me, "You said you have documents?" I said yes, and I reached into my bag. I set the envelope down on the hood of the cruiser. 2 years of carrying it, and it took 4 seconds to put it down. My mother's writing was right there on the front of it, soft at the edges from all those Thursdays in my bag. Maya, keep this safe. I opened it on the warm hood of that car, in the cold, with the deputy beside me, and I took out the deed and the recorded protection, and I laid them flat so he could read them in the porch light. He read. He took his time, the way the deputy who came when I was a kid would never have, the way I'd somehow earned by saying one accurate word instead of 40 angry ones. And while he read, the porch went very quiet. Linda stopped talking, which I had never once seen her do. My father came down. Finally, the man came down off the porch, but not for me. He came down to read over the deputy's shoulder, and I watched his face as he understood what his dead wife had done, what she'd quietly arranged in her last months, the protection she'd built for me against the exact thing he was now standing in the middle of. He went a kind of gray. The deputy stepped a few feet away and got on his radio and called it in to the county recorder's office to verify. We all stood there in the cold while a voice on the other end pulled it up. It took maybe 6 minutes. They were the longest 6 minutes of Linda's life, I'd guess, and some of the best of mine. I could feel my own hands wanting to shake, not from fear, from the size of it, from 2 years of being polite finally setting itself down on a car hood, and I put them flat against my thighs and made them be still, because I was not going to let her see them move. I had one job left, and it was to stand there steady while my mother's voice came back from the county office and said, in the only language these people respected, "She's telling the truth." The radio crackled. The deputy listened, said copy, and turned around. And he said to Linda, not to me, "Ma'am, this document is recorded and valid. She has legal right of access to this property. You're going to need to let her in." And Linda said, and I will hear this the rest of my life, the way her voice climbed, "This is my house. Your mother left memories. I'm the one who lives here." Your mother left memories. The exact cruelty she'd been running for 2 years, said out loud at last in front of a sworn officer, that my mother was a ghost, a box of clutter, a sentiment, and Linda was the reality. And the deputy, God bless his bored young heart, looked at the recorded deed on the hood of his car, and then at Linda and said the most beautiful sentence, "No, ma'am. By this, she's got the standing. You live here, but she has the right to be here. Go unlock the door, please. Go unlock the door, please." Linda did not move. The deputy said it again, less patient. And I watched the woman who had changed the lock, who had held a number up against the glass, who had boxed my mother into the garage. I watched her have to turn around, walk back up her own porch steps, take out her key, and unlock the door she'd locked against me. Her hand was shaking. She fitted the key wrong the first time and had to do it again. And the lock turned, and the door my mother told me to keep safe swung open, and the threshold I'd been barred from for 3 weeks was just open, in front of me, with Linda standing back from it because a man with a badge had told her to step back. I didn't run in. I didn't gloat. I picked my mother's envelope up off the hood, and I put it back in my bag, and I walked up the steps past Linda, and I crossed the threshold into the house. And my father stood in the hall and said, Maya, and reached out, and I walked past him too. Within 100 feet of crossing that threshold, I was standing in the front room, the room with the gold light, where she'd held my hand and told me she'd made sure. I stood there and I let myself breathe. The almost shaking in my hands finally let go. I was inside. She'd made sure. The deputy left once Linda had unlocked the door, and the situation was, in his words, civil. It was not civil, but it was legal, and legal was all I'd come for. I didn't stay long that day. I walked through the house once, slowly, the way you walk through a place that's been given back to you. Then I left, and I came back the next morning with a locksmith of my own, and I had the locks changed again, back to keys I held, because the recorded protection gave me the standing to do exactly that. And Linda's back rent claim, the $42,000 she'd held against the glass, evaporated the second the county confirmed I'd never been a tenant in the first place. You cannot charge rent to a person who holds a recorded right to be there. The whole invention came apart in a single phone call to the recorder's office. 3 weeks of boundaries, undone in 6 minutes on a car hood. My father tried to broker a peace about a week later. He left a voicemail, his own voice this time, not Linda's initial, which told me she'd finally let him near his own phone now that the leverage was gone. He said maybe we'd all overreacted. He said Linda felt ambushed. He said families shouldn't involve sheriffs. He said, near the end, in the voice he used to use when I was small, and he wanted me to let something go, your mother wouldn't have wanted this. I want to tell you I struggled with that one, because I did, for about a day. Your mother wouldn't have wanted this. And then I realized he had it exactly backward, and the realization set me free of him in a way 3 weeks of locked doors hadn't. My mother had wanted precisely this. She'd built it. She'd gone to a county office while she was dying and constructed the legal machine that produced this exact afternoon, the deputy, the verification, the lock turning under Linda's shaking hand. This wasn't the thing my mother wouldn't have wanted. This was the thing she'd reached forward 2 years past her own death to make sure happened. I never called him back. It's been about a year now. Let me tell you where it all settled, because this channel finishes its stories and you've earned the end of this one. The house is mine to use, by my mother's design and the county's record, and Linda and my father still live in it. That part surprises people. But the protection my mother recorded was about access and claim, not eviction. She wasn't trying to throw her own husband into the street. She was trying to make sure her daughter could never be locked out of her. So, we exist in a strange cold truce. They have the daily run of the place. I have the keys, the legal standing, and the right to walk in any Thursday I choose. I don't choose most Thursdays anymore. The point was never to haunt them. The point was that they could not haunt me out. But I did one thing, that first month, that I'd drive 100 miles to do again. I went into the garage, and I carried those 4 boxes marked clutter back into the house, and I put my mother back. Her photos went up on the hallway wall where the nails were still in the plaster. Her crossword books went on the shelf. Her reading glasses, I kept those. They're in my own car now, in the console, because I lose mine constantly, and it turns out I buy the same cheap drugstore ones, 3 at a time, exactly like she did. Some inheritances you don't get a choice about. Linda watched me hang the photos back up, and she didn't say one word. There was nothing left to say. The smile through the glass doesn't work on a person who stood at a cruiser and watched your whole story come apart in a phone call. Here's where I'll leave it. They spent 3 weeks calling it back rent. $42,000 for the crime of loving a house and the dead woman who lived in it. But the only rent that house ever truly cost was paid a long time before any of them. In tax stamps I handed over in a cold driveway, in a roof I watched go on in the January wind, in the receipts I kept without knowing why, and most of all in one envelope a dying woman recorded at a county office so that no lock her husband ever changed could keep her daughter out. The house was never going to cost me $42,000. It had already been paid for, in full, by her. So if there's a person in your life still protecting you from somewhere you can't see them, a parent, a grandmother, someone who made a quiet arrangement you haven't discovered yet, go look for it before you need it. Open the box marked clutter. The people who really loved you tended to leave the important things somewhere they trusted you'd eventually look. And if you're the kind of person who finds these stories in the evening, when the long shift is finally over and the house is quiet, the ones where the quiet daughter turns out to have been carrying the key the whole time, then stay close. The next one's about a daughter who paid for an entire anniversary party and got pointed to a folding chair in the garage and the silver gift box she carried in that nobody let her open. There's a reason the whole room goes silent when it finally gets opened. Subscribe so it finds you, and ring the bell so you're not the last to know how it ends. I'll see you there.